So Princess Anne just walked into Clarence's house, didn't even knock properly, and handed King Charles a blue leather file that completely detonated his marriage from the inside. And Camilla had no idea it was coming. The part that's genuinely staggering isn't just that Anne had been quietly building a dossier for 3 years, but that Camilla had spent those exact same 3 years constructing a shadow government inside the palace that controlled who got access to the king, what briefings reached his desk, and which family members were quietly frozen out of his schedule. Charles was being managed like an asset, not a husband, and his own wife was the architect. You need to understand the timing here because it makes everything worse. Anne didn't storm in during some public scandal or after a leaked tabloid story. She chose a completely ordinary evening when Camilla was only rooms away, probably thinking she was secure, probably reviewing the next day's appointments she'd already had rerouted through her private office. The Princess Royal arrived without aides, asked Charles to close the door himself, and then placed that file between them like a warrant. Charles didn't touch it at first. He pushed it back across the desk and warned Anne that accusing his wife of deception could fracture the family beyond repair. He wanted her to withdraw the claim before it became impossible to contain. And Anne, with that absolutely unshakable calm she's famous for, told him she had waited precisely because anger wasn't evidence. She'd spent years collecting correspondence, handwritten amendments, internal memoranda. She wasn't bringing him gossip. She was bringing him a documented chain of events that proved his household had been quietly redirected without his knowledge. Before we get into the really damning details, take a second to subscribe to Prime Archive so you don't miss where the story goes next. The closed file changed everything when Charles finally opened it, and I mean his entire understanding of who had been shaping his decisions. Correspondence showed Camilla working with household advisors to expand her authority over senior appointments, family briefings, and access to the monarch. Royal briefings are the reports and schedules that determine what the sovereign knows, whom he meets, and which decisions reach him first. Controlling those is controlling the crown. Charles recognized his wife's handwriting on multiple pages. One carried a date from 3 years earlier, which means this wasn't some panicked reaction to recent pressure. It had been growing methodically while he trusted the people nearest to him. Then he reached a memorandum that stopped him cold. It described a system allowing Camilla to decide who reached him during periods of illness, exhaustion, travel, or private retreat. Beside a senior royal's name were 2 words: anticipated resistance. That senior royal was Anne. Camilla hadn't just prepared for authority, she had identified the one person most likely to stop her and built protocols specifically designed to neutralize that obstacle. The irony is so sharp it's almost cruel. To the outside world, Princess Anne and Queen Camilla stood on the same balconies, attended the same ceremonies, and served the same crown. Behind closed doors, they represented 2 completely incompatible definitions of loyalty. Anne believes influence must be earned through sacrifice. She's the hardest working royal by any metric, doing hundreds of engagements a year without fanfare. Camilla came to believe survival required access, preparation, and control. And somewhere along the way, she stopped distinguishing between protecting her position and undermining her husband. Between them stood Charles, brother to one, husband to the other, and now the wounded center of a betrayal neither woman could escape. He remained alone with the dossier long after Anne left, and you have to picture what that solitude looked like. This is a man who has known his sister through every stage of his life: childhood rivalry, the crushing weight of expectation, the years when he was confident, and the years when duty left him utterly exhausted. The Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, has never softened the truth to protect his feelings. That's precisely why her accusation hurt so deeply. If Anne was willing to bring him this file, then silence had already become more dangerous than scandal. Camilla's history made the betrayal more complicated, not less. She endured decades of rejection, humiliation, and public judgment before finally securing a place beside the man she loved. The Queen Consort gained recognition without ever gaining complete peace because she understood something Anne never had to fear: that if Charles weakened, the acceptance surrounding her would vanish with his protection. That fear doesn't justify what she did, but it explains why control started looking like survival. Charles remembered the nights when she studied him through isolation and doubt, listened when others demanded, comforted him when duty left no room for weakness. The same woman who helped him believe he could endure the crown had apparently prepared a system that could shape who reached him and what he was allowed to hear. Love and betrayal had become so tangled he couldn't separate one from the other, and felt no victory walking out of that room. She gripped the back of a chair in the corridor and closed her eyes because she knew exposing Camilla might protect her brother's authority, but it could also destroy the final place where he had felt emotionally safe. Her own name appeared repeatedly throughout the correspondence. Camilla had identified her as the strongest obstacle to altering the household's balance, and recommended that sensitive matters reach Charles only after passing through the Queen's office. When Charles summoned his private secretary and placed one marked page on the desk, he asked whether instructions had ever been issued in his name without direct approval. The official looked down. Then he hesitated. That pause carried more truth than any confession. The betrayal began on paper, but its true origin lay 3 years earlier in one private exchange that transformed Camilla's fear into a secret campaign. After a private royal dinner at Windsor, Camilla overheard a conversation about what would happen if Charles suddenly became unable to manage his full workload. Nobody accused her. Nobody threatened her position. William spoke carefully about continuity, while Anne warned that duty couldn't depend on one exhausted person carrying every burden. Continuity planning meant preparing the monarchy to keep functioning if its leader became ill or temporarily unavailable. To everyone else, it was responsible preparation. To Camilla, shaped by decades of rejection and public hostility, it sounded like people were planning for a future in which Charles could no longer protect her. She left the dining room without revealing her unease, but as she passed the library, voices reached her through a half-closed door. A senior advisor told Anne that during any prolonged absence by Charles, the Blood family must remain the unquestioned center. Anne didn't challenge the statement, she merely asked how stability would be maintained. But Camilla heard something harsher. She believed Anne and the advisor had already decided that the Queen would become secondary the moment her husband weakened. Charles found her awake hours later beside an untouched cup of tea. She asked whether she would still matter if he could no longer defend her position. He smiled, called the fear impossible, and kissed her forehead. The king believed affection had answered the question. It had not. She felt loved but unheard, and by morning that fear had hardened into resolve. Camilla requested a confidential meeting with the same household advisor and asked for a documented assessment explaining which powers could operate through the Queen's office without a public announcement or formal transfer from Charles. The official prepared a private memorandum, a written internal proposal outlining possible authority, and that paper became the first document inside Anne's blue dossier. The questions changed quickly after that. Continuity became influence. Influence became control over appointments, schedules, correspondence, and private access to Charles. Years later, Anne discovered the advisor who drafted that first memorandum still served inside the household, and worse, he was scheduled to meet Camilla the morning after the exposure. With the origin of the deception finally clear, Anne knew there could be no more quiet investigation. Camilla had to be confronted before the machinery she created could protect her. When Camilla entered what she expected to be another carefully managed family discussion, she found Anne standing beside the fireplace, Charles seated behind a desk, and the blue dossier lying open between them. No aides, no private secretaries, no soft language, prepared to preserve appearances. Anne looked directly at the Queen and asked the one question Camilla had spent 3 years ensuring Charles would never hear. How much of his crown were you planning to control? Charles had cleared his private study before the meeting began, removing every official who might later absorb blame. The dossier was a formal collection of evidence-gathering correspondence, amendments, and proposals into one record. He asked Anne to leave because his anger had become too personal, and that choice placed his sister directly against his wife with nowhere left for either woman to hide. Camilla stared at Anne as disbelief gave way to fury. She called the accusation a distortion and insisted the documents concerned contingency planning, not ambition. Every proposal had been designed to protect Charles if illness, exhaustion, or pressure made normal routines impossible. She turned toward her husband, expecting him to reject the attack, and he remained completely silent. That silence wounded her more deeply than any charge. Anne stepped closer and told Camilla that protection carried out through secrecy was not loyalty, no matter how carefully it was described. Then she revealed she had examined the handwritten amendments herself, and Camilla's expression changed because she now understood Anne hadn't arrived with rumor. She had arrived with proof. Charles lifted one page from the file, and his voice tightened as he asked why his wife had proposed controlling private access to him whenever he became physically or emotionally diminished. Camilla reached for the document, but the king pulled it back. The movement was small, yet it broke something between them. She admitted writing the amendments, but insisted they were never meant to take effect without his eventual approval. Anne answered with 3 examples already operating inside the household. Certain briefings had been rerouted. Sensitive requests had passed through Camilla's office. Months earlier, Anne herself had been excluded from a confidential family discussion under one of the recommended procedures. The Queen denied ordering that exclusion and said an advisor must have acted beyond the limits she intended. Charles rose and asked both women to leave, but his final warning stopped Camilla at the door. She was not to contact any household official until he discovered who had been acting under her authority. The greater danger now rested with the unseen officials who had turned Camilla's private fears into functioning royal power. She had written the questions, corrected the proposals, and guarded the secret, but she hadn't moved palace schedules, redirected briefings, or altered access alone. Someone had taken her private anxieties and converted them into daily procedure. Charles spread the documents across his desk and began tracing how each private suggestion had entered the household's daily routine. Royal authority doesn't always arrive through a grand order. It often moves through briefing folders, appointment lists, schedules, and recommendations that decide what the monarch sees before he can make a choice. Several officials had convinced themselves that greater influence from Camilla would create stability whenever the king became exhausted or overburdened, yet he had never formally approved that power. Charles dismissed everyone except his private secretary and pointed to one marked schedule, asking how many decisions had reached him only after other options were quietly removed. The official couldn't give a number. The monarch didn't shout. Humiliation replaced anger as he realized his consent may have been manufactured by limiting what he was allowed to consider. Trust had made him vulnerable, and people serving under his name had mistaken that trust for permission. When William entered and found his father staring at a calendar covered with handwritten changes, he immediately understood why the discovery mattered. A monarch cannot lead freely if those around him shape every choice before it reaches his desk. Charles admitted he no longer knew which meetings reflected his wishes and which had been designed for him. William remained beside him, but even his calm presence couldn't soften the confession. The review uncovered altered briefing routes where certain family concerns had been instructed to pass through the Queen's office before reaching Charles. One advisor accepted responsibility for applying the system, but insisted Camilla had never directly ordered those restrictions. He explained through a recorded internal interview that her handwritten comments had been treated as strategic guidance. That answer made the danger worse. She had created a structure that others expanded until even she could no longer control its reach. Anne entered before the questioning ended, lifted the advisor's palace pass from the desk, and placed it beside the blue dossier. The pass granted access to restricted royal offices, and its removal meant an immediate end to his working authority. Charles ordered the official suspended from every duty while a complete examination continued. By nightfall, the decision had traveled through the household, and Camilla understood what came next. Her staff, communications, and private channels were about to be dismantled. The first consequence arrived without ceremony when Camilla's senior aide entered her sitting room carrying a revised schedule and placed it quietly on the table. Meetings had been canceled, briefing privileges withdrawn, and requests that once moved directly through her office would now require written approval from Charles. For 3 years, Camilla had prepared for the day she might lose influence, yet when it happened, the loss came not through public rejection, but through her husband's silent signature. She read the schedule once, then again, as though repetition might change its meaning. The temporary directive returned control of appointments, access, and confidential briefings to the king's private office, the small team responsible for managing what reaches the monarch and when. Charles had not removed her title, but he had removed the channels through which she had built power. Anne would oversee the review only, not inherit the queen's influence, proving her aim was to restore boundaries rather than claim authority for herself. Camilla removed her glasses and asked whether Charles had sent a private message. Her aide lowered his eyes and said there was none. She folded the schedule carefully, but her hands betrayed her. The queen had believed she was protecting her husband from confusion, pressure, and hostile voices. Now she understood the harder truth. By acting without his knowledge, she had denied him the right to decide what protection looked like. Charles remained in another wing of the residence, refusing both confrontation and comfort. He reviewed each document alone until his attention settled on the wedding photograph beside his desk. He lifted it, held it for several seconds, and placed it inside a drawer. He didn't destroy it, he simply couldn't look at their happiness while reading proof of her secrecy. His pain came from more than altered schedules. The person who had known his deepest fears had used his vulnerability to justify a system he had never approved. Anne continued examining the seized correspondence until a sealed letter appeared inside Camilla's private papers. The queen had written it but never sent it. And in that documented confession, she admitted fearing that William and Anne would eventually reduce her to a ceremonial widow with no voice. The words changed the emotional weight of everything. Terror, not simple ambition, had driven the plan. Anne didn't excuse the deception, but she understood that fear could explain a betrayal without repairing it. Instead of sending the letter to the review board, a group assembled to judge the conduct of palace officials, she carried it directly to Charles and asked him to face Camilla first as the man who loved her, and only afterward as the monarch responsible for the crown. For the first time since the file was opened, punishment paused. Behind a locked door, Charles prepared to ask whether anything honest remained between them. There were no advisors waiting outside, no folders arranged on the table, no royal language left to hide behind. Charles asked Camilla to meet him in the small morning room where they had once spoken freely before the crown transformed every private fear into a public risk. She entered prepared to defend herself, but when she saw the unsent letter beside his hand, she understood the conversation was no longer about authority. It was about whether their marriage had survived the truth. Charles had chosen that room because it belonged to an earlier version of their life before every conversation carried the weight of the monarchy. The crown meant not only the sovereign's title, but the duties, limits, and public trust attached to the throne. Here, however, he wanted no officials and no ceremony. Anne remained absent by design. She had delivered the evidence and the sealed letter, then told her brother that the final reckoning had to belong to the husband who had been deceived, not the sister who uncovered it. Charles asked why Camilla had trusted palace advisors with fears she had hidden from him. His voice carried pain rather than rage. She answered that she had tried to speak about the future, but each time he had smiled, reassured her, and treated her anxiety as something love alone could silence. The king realized he had heard her words without understanding them, yet being unheard did not give her the right to build authority in secret. Camilla admitted the fear plainly. If Charles became ill, if William moved closer to the throne, or if the family closed ranks around blood and succession, the established order deciding who inherits the crown, she believed she would become powerless and unwanted. She had spent years fighting for acceptance, and the thought of losing everything had consumed her. He told her that terror explained the beginning, but it could not erase the betrayal that followed. Camilla removed her wedding ring and placed it between them, saying she would accept whatever decision he made. Charles stared at the ring, remembering what it had cost them both to reach this moment. Then he pushed it slowly back toward her. The marriage would remain, the hidden power would not. Charles declared that Camilla would keep her title and public place beside him, but every independent channel controlling appointments, private access, and confidential family briefings would end permanently. She accepted without argument, agreed to dismiss every remaining advisor linked to the secret structure, and finally admitted that protecting her position had nearly destroyed the trust that gave it meaning. Charles then summoned Anne and William to witness the formal restoration of household boundaries. The marriage hadn't ended, but the illusion surrounding it had. And by morning, one image outside Buckingham Palace would show the world that the monarchy had already changed. By sunrise, the secret had escaped the palace. The public didn't yet possess every memorandum or every painful word exchanged behind closed doors. It needed only one fact. Princess Anne had exposed a 3-year effort by Camilla's office to influence access to the king without his full knowledge. What had begun as a private reckoning now became a national test of trust, marriage, authority, and the limits of power beside the throne. Charles approved a tightly controlled palace statement before the morning broadcast began. It confirmed that household procedures were being reorganized and declared that authority over senior appointments and royal access, the system deciding who could meet, brief, or communicate privately with the sovereign, belonged solely to the monarch. The careful wording protected the crown, but it couldn't conceal the scale of the rupture. Something serious had happened, and Britain understood it immediately. William supported the decision through a recorded statement issued by his office. He defended clear constitutional boundaries, the rules separating legitimate royal authority from private influence, but refused to condemn Camilla personally. He wouldn't turn his father's pain into an opportunity for himself, and that restraint strengthened his position as the future king while denying the public the family war many expected. Anne watched the first reports alone. The headlines praised her courage, yet she felt no triumph. She had wanted a dangerous system corrected, not Charles's marriage reduced to entertainment. The Princess Royal heard commentators call her the woman who had saved the king from his own household. But each dramatic phrase reminded her that her brother's humiliation was now national property. Camilla faced a harsher judgment. Commentators described her as calculating, controlling, and hungry for power. She remained silent until an old photograph of herself beside Charles appeared beneath the words, 3 years of secrets. The Queen switched off the television. She had kept her marriage, but the public trust she spent decades building was collapsing in a single morning. Rain fell outside Buckingham Palace as a crowd gathered near the gates. Newspaper sellers raised a front page showing Anne leaving Clarence House beneath the headline, "The Princess Who Told the King." One woman stared at it and said quietly, "At least someone protected him." A national broadcaster delivered the deeper warning: informal influence could become genuine authority whenever secrecy replaced accountability. Charles attended his scheduled engagement with Anne, beside him and Camilla absent. Before entering, the king paused and briefly touched his sister's arm. The gesture told the nation that he accepted what she had done. Britain had chosen its symbol in Anne, yet the monarchy's final judgment would be written not by a headline, but by the boundaries Charles imposed on those closest to him. The final meeting wasn't called to debate whether Camilla had concealed the plan. The documents, the handwritten changes, and the altered palace procedures had already established that truth. The only question remaining was what the monarchy would become after it. Charles could protect appearances, punish his wife completely, or admit that love, fear, loyalty, and power had become dangerously entangled. His verdict would decide more than Camilla's future. It would define the kind of king he intended to remain. Charles assembled Anne, Camilla, William, and a newly appointed senior household team behind closed doors. No one came to argue. Everyone understood the 3-year chapter had reached its end. The hidden advisory structure, the unofficial network that had redirected information and access around the monarch, was formally dissolved. Every private restriction was canceled, all related papers were ordered into the royal archives, and officials who had acted beyond their authority were permanently removed from sensitive duties. Charles turned toward Camilla before addressing anyone else. He told her she would remain his wife and queen, but she would never again operate a separate channel of power around him. The king made the boundary absolute. Trust would have to be rebuilt through honesty, not protected through influence, status, or secret arrangements. She listened without interruption, knowing that keeping her marriage did not erase what her actions had caused. Camilla accepted responsibility before the family. She didn't blame Anne, the dismissed advisors, or the hostility she had endured outside palace walls. The queen admitted that fear of losing her place had driven her to endanger the relationship she wanted most desperately to preserve. Her confession came through a recorded statement entered into the household review, leaving no doubt about what she had accepted. Anne closed the blue dossier and fastened its clasp. She handed it to the royal archivist, the official responsible for preserving important monarchy records for the future. Charles watched the file leave the room before turning to his sister. "You did what I could not see needed doing," he told her. Anne received no new title, expanded authority, or public reward. Her victory was her brother's restored confidence. Camilla lost the private influence she had tried to secure, but kept the marriage she had feared losing. Charles preserved both his crown and his compassion, though neither escaped untouched. The monarchy survived because truth arrived before silence became permanent damage. Love could explain fear, but it could never justify control. The blue file was sealed, the secret authority dismantled, and the family left with one irreversible lesson: the crown can forgive fear, but it cannot survive deception unless truth is finally allowed into the room. And here's what I keep coming back to. Camilla spent 3 years building a system she genuinely believed was protecting her husband, but she never once asked him if he wanted that protection. She asked advisors, she drafted memoranda, she corrected proposals in her own handwriting, she identified which family members posed the greatest threat to her influence, and she did all of it while smiling beside him at state dinners and royal engagements. The deception wasn't just the documents. It was every morning she woke up beside Charles, knowing she had quietly rerouted briefings he would never see. Every evening, she kissed him goodnight while officials she had empowered continued reshaping his household. Anne understood something fundamental that Camilla forgot in her fear. Loyalty that operates in secret isn't loyalty at all. It's just control.